Good morning. Got to get all situated here. Okay, so this morning, hopefully you remember the plan here is to continue our short series on what we could call Old Testament basics. This is all to help us when we read not just the Old Testament, but the Bible, especially narratives. Last week we got a little bit into the chronology, along with some of the cultural differences between ancient Israel's and our own. And a lot of what lies ahead this year, next year, and today will build on what we covered last Sunday. So hopefully you remembered the assignment to read the account of Judah and Tamar, his daughter-in-law there in Genesis 38, and to look for how an understanding of the ancient world's patriarchal society is crucial for appreciating the events in the story. It serves as a good example. If one doesn't really have a good clue about Israel's tribal culture, then much in that chapter is going to seem pretty confusing, if just not downright disturbing. So before we dive into that chapter, let's go back and revisit our simple timeline. At this point, we're just keeping things very, very basic here. Over the course of time, we'll be filling things in. The goal right now is very attainable. I like to see everybody be able to pull out a blank sheet of paper and write out each of these 7 time periods in order. Should be pretty easy to do. So let's just do a quick review from last week. And as a reminder, these sections on this timeline are not according to scale. They're just periods here to help us visualize the major time slots. So the first period we could just simply call the beginnings, the creation account, Adam and Eve and the fall, takes us all the way up to Noah and the flood. Next would be the patriarchs. We'd start here with Abraham, the father of the Jews, his son Isaac, his son Jacob, and Jacob's 12 sons, the 12 patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. And this period extends from Abraham to Moses and the Exodus out of Egypt. And the third we could call this period sojourn, conquest, settlement. This is a large section in the Old Testament. We start with the Exodus, the 40 years of wandering in the desert, Joshua and Caleb, the advancements upon Canaan, and the era of the judges who governed Israel once they settled in the Promised Land. Next is the united monarchy. Basically, 3 kings should come to mind. The first is King David, then Solomon, okay? Followed by the divided monarchy upon Solomon's death. His son Rehoboam leads with a heavy hand, and as a result, as we talked about last week, 10 of the 12 tribes reject him as king and seceded from the union. They reside in the northern part of the land, and they retain the name Israel. Their first king was Jeroboam. Several more kings followed him in the coming years. Meanwhile, Solomon's son Rehoboam presides over the southern kingdom, which includes the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. The southern kingdom was commonly referred to as Judah, and it included the key city of Jerusalem, and many kings came after him as well. And then this brings us to the exile. There's actually 2 exiles. The northern kingdom, Israel, falls to the Assyrians. They're taken captive. Many are deported to Assyria, and they're just basically absorbed into the culture there and the people. 130 years after that, the southern kingdom, Judah, falls to the Babylonians, and many are deported to Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar orders Solomon's temple to be ransacked and destroyed in all that. And then we have the return from exile back to the homeland, and here we are primarily talking about captives taken from the southern kingdom, Judah. The Persians have now conquered both the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and its king, King Cyrus, permits Jews to return to their land. And this takes place in 3 main stages stretched out over a period of about 100 years. And this period also includes what historians refer to as Second Temple Judaism or post-exilic Judaism, and under leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah, Israel is reestablished and work begins to rebuild Solomon's temple. So the last events to be described that belong to the Old Testament era are those recorded in the final chapter of Nehemiah, and after this is what we would call the intertestament period, 400 years between the Old Testament and New Testament. Okay, everybody good so far? All right, so over the course of time, we're going to be filling this in with more information, people and events and so forth. For this morning, I'd like to take a moment before we get into Genesis 38, take a moment to match some of the books of the Old Testament to these time periods, and in particular the historical books, that is the books that record history as opposed to books of poetry and prophecy and so on, and just match them, not when the book was written, that's not going to be that helpful, but what the book is giving an account of. Okay, so I'll just go over this quickly, just so that we have some familiarity with it, and because we'll be visiting this again and again in the future. And because we aren't concerned at this point about precision, I'm just going to offer kind of a quick comment on how to remember things in a general way, as you'll see. So we have in the beginnings, into that period there. This is Genesis chapters 1 through 10, so just easy to think of as the first part of Genesis. Pretty common sense there. And then we have the patriarchs. This would be Genesis 11 to Exodus 14. So most of Genesis and part of Exodus, early part of Exodus. And then the sojourn, conquest, and settlement. This would be Exodus 15 through 40. And the other three books of the Pentateuch, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and along with Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. So, most of Exodus to the end of Ruth. All right? And then the United Monarchy gets a little more involved here. We got 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1 Kings 1 through 11, 1 Chronicles, and 2 Chronicles 1 through 9. A little hard to remember, but basically 1st and 2nd Samuel, first part of 1 Kings, all of 1 Chronicles, first third of 2 Chronicles. Is that easy to remember? Okay, then we have the divided monarchy, 1 Kings 12 through 25, 2 Kings 1 through 16, 2 Chronicles 10 through 36. So second half of 1 Kings to the first half of, second half of 1 Kings to the first half of 2 Kings and the last 2/3 of 2 Chronicles. This won't be on a test. Don't worry about it. All right. And then the exile, 2 Kings 17 to the end of the book, and just a very brief account of it in the last chapter of 1 Chronicles or 2 Chronicles. And then the return from exile in the Second Temple, Jerusalem, Ezra and Nehemiah. And also Esther. The story of Esther takes place during this time period, but doesn't really describe it. And there's also just a brief account of it in the last chapter of 2 Chronicles as well. So it's not essential that you memorize all this. We just want to have some familiarity, as it would be helpful, and we'll be getting into it more later on. Okay, everyone? So far, so good? So let's move on to our main subject for today. We're looking at an example here where having some grasp of the ancient Israel's tribal culture and the differences from ours is crucial for understanding what is going on. Because if you're just doing a surface reading of that chapter, you could be in trouble. And this is the account of Onan and Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38. So hopefully you'll remember this illustration and what the point it is used to illustrate, because all this is going to be relevant for today. How many remember this illustration? How many remember the point that was being illustrated? All right, good. All right, some of the elements of a tribal culture that we talked about last week and will come up in today's narrative. We want to look at some of these. One is especially this business about patriarchal households. And we often find adult sons with their wives and children living together with their parents and their adult siblings, also married with children, forming a community living situation. They may be living in separate tents or in separate living quarters in an actual structured home, but they live and work together. In this arrangement, the authority of the household rests on the patriarch, the oldest adult living man. Now, depending on who you are in that household, he might be your father, he could be your grandfather, might even be your great-grandfather, could be your oldest uncle, or even your oldest brother. And if you married into the household, the patriarch might be your father-in-law, grandfather-in-law, or brother-in-law. Whatever the case, he manages the affairs, he calls the shots, even that of arranging marriages and enforcing certain customs and laws, and even God's law. And in this patriarchal society, we also have the significance of the firstborn son. Upon the patriarch's death, his firstborn son assumes his role, receives a double portion of the inheritance, this so that he has the resources he needs to run the household. The firstborn son is the second most significant place in the household, and it's a very highly treasured spot. All through his life, he is being groomed to be the patriarch and is therefore given more responsibility, more authority. He's like the favorite child. Eventually, it will fall on him to continue the household, the family name, and the family's legacy. However, the designation of firstborn, something we need to remember here, is more of a legal thing than biological. It is naturally assumed that the son who is born first will have this, but as we know from the story of Jacob and Esau, the status, right, blessing of firstborn can be transferred from one son to another. We all understand that, correct? And in some cases, a man can be a firstborn son to someone who isn't even his biological father, something that results from following the Levirate law, which comes up in today's story. The Levirate law highlights two important things about the culture of the ancient world. First, it shows us the significance of carrying on the family line and family name, and just how valuable and important it is for a household to have a firstborn son, because it really was a big deal back then. And secondly, the Levirate law shows us that widows were honored and that there was a mechanism in place for them to be cared for. So we'll explain this law here in a little bit, but all of this and more comes to bear in our story here in Genesis 38. So how many did read it this week? All right, great, excellent. You get to go in line first at the Markle picnic. How's that? So if you want to follow along, which could be helpful, you can turn there to Genesis 38. It's not necessary that you do, but you're welcome to if you'd like. And as a warning, there are some parts of the Bible that actually are not suitable really for younger children. And a couple verses in this chapter, along with some of my comments, could warrant a PG-13 rating, right? It actually had a PG-21 rating until I revised some things this morning, so I toned it down a little bit. So even though our kids are in Sunday school class, through the years, people have told me that they appreciate getting the heads up on that sort of thing. So there it is. My mom usually listens to my sermons, and so this is the place when she hears these warnings, she switches to Alistair Begg or John MacArthur. She does want to hear it, not from her son. All right. What?
One sympathizes.
Yes. All right, so a little bit of context here before we start. In the chapter before this, chapter 37, we have the very familiar story of the 12 sons of Jacob out in the field, jealous of Joseph. The others conspire to kill him. They throw him in a pit, a dried up well, intending to leave him there to die. Reuben, Jacob's firstborn son, acted like he was in on the plan, but had intended to secretly rescue Joseph at an opportune time. So an opportunity came up for them to sell Joseph into slavery before Reuben could rescue him, and Judah talked his brothers into doing that instead of killing him. So chapter 37 ends with Jacob hearing that his son was killed by wild animals and is paralyzed by grief that just cannot be comforted. The story about Joseph picks up again in chapter 39. Our chapter here, 38, is stuck in there between those, kind of like an interruption to the story of Joseph. And it seems that the author wants to take a quick moment to fill the reader in on what happens next to Judah before he continues on with Joseph. So that's the context. There's much here to like about Judah, especially later when he offers to take the place of his brother Benjamin, a very honorable thing, if you might remember that from your readings. But as this chapter will show, Judah can be pretty disgusting as well. In fact, it seems that one of the author's purposes for interjecting the story here is to show us just how things went from bad to worse for Judah, his moral digression. Sharing in the sin, the crime of selling his brother into slavery, spirals him downward. And we'll read through the story, and We'll see that, and I'll stop along the way here to make comments. So virtually all translations render this pretty much the same, but I think the New Living Translation does a pretty good job with this narrative, and so I'll be reading from it. All right, so starting with verse 1, about this time, Judah left home and moved to Adullam. I think I'm saying this right, I'm not sure, where he stayed with a man named Hira. There he saw a Canaanite woman, the daughter of Shua, and he married her. So that verse gets me every time. There he saw a Canaanite woman, the daughter of Shua, and he married her. Okay, no dating, no courtship, no engagement. He just sees her and marries her. All right, apparently that's how they did it back then. There's probably a lot going on that they're not writing about, but this is the way it's worded. It's really funny. All right, so it is worth noting here, a more serious note, Judah leaves his father's household and marries outside the family. And though the author doesn't comment on it, but given what we know about the culture, it would seem somewhat unusual for a son, especially one who isn't married, to leave his household and move away. And we might speculate that Judah was having a hard time dealing with his role in selling Joseph and the whole cover-up of lying to their father Jacob. Day after day, he is watching his father dying inside, crippled by grief, and so this is contributing to his guilt. We could also assume that there's probably a lot of tension among the brothers as well about what had happened. And Judah gets to the point where he just can't take it any longer. He wants to get away from it all, fresh start somewhere else. The text doesn't say whether he had his father's blessing or not to leave. And the text doesn't say whether his father was involved in Judah's marriage to the Canaanite woman. But on the surface, it appears that Judah just simply left home, fell for the first woman he saw, and married her. Whatever the case, taken together, chapters 37 and 38 do show us that Jacob's family was, at this point, being fragmented. Joseph is gone, and now Judah. And things are just starting to unravel and come apart. All right, continuing on with verse 2, when Judah slept with her, she became pregnant, gave birth to a son, and he named the boy Then she became pregnant again and gave birth to another son, and she named him Onan. And she gave birth to a third son and named him Shelah. At the time of Shalah's birth, they were living at Kezib. So at this point, Judah's progeny looks pretty promising with 3 sons. He can rest assured that they will all eventually produce offspring and that his household and name and legacy will continue. Verse 6, in the course of time, all right, many years now go by, indeed a whole generation, Judah arranged for his firstborn son, to marry a young woman named Tamar. I may be saying Tamar and Tamar back and forth, I'm not sure, but Tamar. But was a wicked man in the Lord's sight, so the Lord took his life. Then Judah said to Er's brother Onan, go and marry Tamar, as our law requires of the brother of a man who has died. You must produce an heir for your brother. All right, now notice how Judah, the patriarch of the household, arranges the marriages for his sons. Again, this gives us insight into the amount of authority a patriarch wields over those in his family, even adults. And, you know, we look back and we kind of say to ourselves, well, that's just the way they did it back then. We don't think much more about it. But at the same time, it might be helpful if we just tried to appreciate this, climb into their skin a little bit, and imagine what that might be like. You know, is any guy here willing to let your dad tell you when you will marry and who you will marry? Anybody? You know, so as you can see, the oldest son, dies, leaving his wife, Tamar, a widow. She is now part of Judah's household, and he is now responsible to provide for her. And again, this is generally done by arranging a marriage for her. The best means of providing for her needs is a husband and then sons who will grow up and take care of her in her older age. But in this case here, the son who dies is Judah's oldest, his firstborn, the one who inherit a double portion of his estate, rule as the patriarch of the household, and carry on the name. And so this is where the levirate law comes into play. And apparently it was quite common in many cultures in the ancient world. Later on, we see that it was codified in the law of Moses, and it is spelled out in Deuteronomy 25. So the word levirate, 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 comes from a Latin term that means husband's brother. I think we are all familiar with this. We've heard of it. It is the duty of a man to marry the sonless widow of his deceased brother. Comes up time and time again in the Bible. This so that she will bear children and carry on the family line and family name of that deceased brother. And these marriages were arranged by the patriarch of the household. Onan's oldest brother has died, and so Judah doesn't really give him a choice. Onan, marry your sister-in-law Tamar and produce children. Your brother God rest his soul, needs a firstborn son to carry on his name and his estate. So let's try to picture this for a moment. If you are an unmarried man and have an older brother, I want you to imagine marrying his wife, your sister-in-law, if he were to die, regardless of the age difference, regardless of whether you found her agreeable or not. Not just live together as husband and wife, but you got to have sex with her so as to have children. Maybe hard to imagine. And the oldest son of that union wouldn't even be yours, technically. You would be responsible to raise him, care for him, protect him, love him, educate him. But in reality, he would belong to your deceased brother. He would be your brother's firstborn, not yours. So this arrangement doesn't sound very appealing, does it? Well, as we will see, it wasn't very appealing to Onan. And while we're trying to imagine things, if you are a woman married to the oldest son of a family, well, same thing. Consider what happens if your husband dies. How well do you like your brother-in-laws? And you don't even get to pick which one you prefer. You could end up with the obnoxious one or the loser who watches video games all day in his parents' basement. Who knows? So this whole arrangement seems really bizarre to us in the modern world, especially here in the West. It even seems disturbing at certain points. But it was the way of the land back then, not just common, but expected. And when necessary, it was your solemn duty to participate in these arrangements. How many are glad we don't live back then? All right. And now for verse 9. Whether Tamar was liking the idea of Onan becoming her husband, we can't say. But we can say that what Onan thought about the whole arrangement here. Verse 9, but Onan was not willing to have a child who would not be his own heir. All right? Yeah, Tamar might be pretty, seems to be quite agreeable. Maybe I could marry her. I could learn to love her. But children, that's another story. If the firstborn son isn't mine, then forget it. So is this because Onan is a jerk? Well, yes, he is a jerk, but not without some reason, justified or not. Onan stood in line after the death of first in line. Onan is now the one who will eventually run the household, carry on the family name and legacy, receive a double portion of the estate. His kids will be the progeny of Judah, listed in all the genealogies, but not if he produces a son by his brother's widow. All that will change. In his shoes, all of us might be thinking the same thing he was. So on a side note here, it is worth mentioning that this struggle within the household among brothers for supremacy as the firstborn, it goes back, if you will remember, to Jacob himself and his ploy to cheat his brother out of it. It's just kind of an ongoing thing. So back to verse 9, Onan was not willing to have a child who would not be his own. So whenever he had intercourse with his brother's wife, he spilled the semen on the ground. This prevented her from having a child who would belong to his brother. But the Lord considered it evil for Onan to deny a child to his dead brother. So the Lord took Onan's life too. All right, so some of the more modern translations, like the one I just read from, have improved the translation, rendering it whenever instead of when. So coitus interruptus was Onan's persistent practice. He did this every time. And one can only imagine the frustration of Tamar, her new husband refusing her not just a firstborn son, but children. Her first husband was so bad that the Lord took his life. And now his brother Onan is proving to be a real loser as well. Onan's refusal to impregnate his wife, denying a firstborn child to his oldest brother, invokes the anger of the Lord, and he punishes Onan with death. So while we're at it, the sin of Onan has stirred up a lot of discussion over the centuries. I don't want to get into a lot of it now, but even Augustine in the 4th century, he weighed in on it. he used Onan to categorically condemn any sexual activity that tries to prevent the conception of offspring. And others through the years have joined him in that conclusion. In fact, in the early 1700s, a term was coined, onanism, which grouped together all sexual practices where conception was not the objective. And that then became the focus, the sin that God punished in this passage. But a careful reading of the text, shaped by one's understanding of the culture and the importance of the Levirate law, renders really a different conclusion about this, an obvious conclusion. God punished Onan specifically for denying his deceased brother a firstborn son. Now, whether it is proper in the eyes of God to have sexual relations where the intent is not to produce children, that's a discussion worth having, but the passage here in Genesis 38 doesn't really contribute to that discussion. So, at the end of verse 10, Tamar is now a widow yet again. Next in line is Judah's third son, the last son remaining, and this brings us to verse 11. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Go back to your parents' home and remain a widow until my son Shelah is old enough to marry you." So we could guess at this point that he's probably an adolescent. But Judah didn't really intend to do this because he was afraid Shelah would also die like his two brothers. Interesting. So Tamar went back to live in her father's home. So she married into Judah's household. This is where she belongs. Judah has a responsibility to provide for her, but he sends her back to live with her original family, hoping that she will settle in there and do what? Forget the whole thing. And he outright lies to her, promising her a third son. But as we read here, he has no intention of keeping that promise, and she is being treated like dirt in all of this. But as sleazy as he is in all this, Judah does have his reasons, as misguided as they may be. Verse 11 tells us that he believes something is wrong with Tamar, that she is somehow jinxed. Every time she marries one of his sons, what happens? The guy dies. He's only got one son left, Shelah, and there's no way he's going to risk losing him. What he fails to see, however, is that his two sons died because they had sinned and angered the Lord. These deaths had nothing to do with Tamar. She has been the innocent party all along, even compliant with all the ways she has been mistreated. Nonetheless, Judah conjures up this lame excuse. When number 3 gets old enough, he will marry you. In the time, you live as a widow. And by the way, I don't really want to provide for you, so you go back home to your daddy and you can be his problem for a while. In this, Judah puts his daughter-in-law's future at jeopardy with no husband or potential son to care for her. Now for verse 12. Some years later, Judah's wife died. After the time of mourning was over, Judah and his friend Hira the Adullamite went up to Timnah to supervise the shearing of his sheep. Someone told Tamar, "Look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." All right, now, I'm not sure if this contributes to the situation, but it could. Apparently, the whole thing about sheep shearing was a big thing, something the Canaanites and that whole culture there, where they all were living, they turned it into some sort of festivity that included pagan celebrations, acts of ritual fornication to celebrate the magic of fertility. So it's kind of like, here in June, we got Pride Month, and everything everywhere is about promoting the LGBTQ plus agenda. And so in that culture, sheep shearing was apparently one of those times of the year when everything was about promoting sex, sex, and sex. Just lots going on to entice temptations. Secondly, we also know that Judah's wife has died, and so he is, after the time of mourning, vulnerable. And thirdly, we also know that Tamar is irritated, frustrated. A firstborn son has been promised, and she is being jerked around. The third son, Shelah, is now old enough to marry her, but all he gets from Judah is silence. And all this is the makings of a perfect storm. And so this widow, who has been mistreated by the men of her new family, uses the callous whim of her father-in-law to turn the tables on him. Verse 14. Tamar was aware that Shelah had grown up, but no arrangements had been made for her to come and marry him. So she's not going to just remain passive. She changes out of her widow's clothing, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, sat beside the road at the entrance to the village of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. Judah noticed her, thought she was a prostitute since she had covered her face. So he stopped and propositioned her, "Let me have sex with you," he said, not realizing that she was his own daughter-in-law. What a story. The first thing that stands out is just how clueless Judah is in this whole story. He wrongly thinks that the death of his oldest son, is because of Tamar. He wrongly thinks that the death of his next son, Onan, is because of that woman, Tamar. He wrongly thinks that Tamar will bring about the death of his third son, Shelah, if he were to provide him to her. He wrongly thinks that if he sends Tamar away, he won't have to deal with her anymore. As Gomer would say, surprise, surprise, surprise. And he now propositions someone he wrongly believes to be a prostitute, not realizing that she is indeed his very own daughter-in-law, Tamar, a member of his household, exiled, but a member nonetheless. So just a quick note here on her clothing. The passage refers to her wearing the clothes of a widow. Now, such clothing doesn't necessarily reflect a time of mourning. It simply signifies that she was married, her husband had died, and therefore is pledged to one of her husband's brothers, and therefore she is not available. And this is why, in her scheme to trick Judah, she changed clothes to deceive him. And it worked. Returning to verse 16, Tamar asks, "How much will you pay to have sex with me?" This is classic. This has been her whole plan here, is to speak candidly, to get Judah's seed. And so in her eagerness, she perhaps was tempted to say, "Oh, for someone like you, nothing at all. Hurry up." But she plays the whole part, and she plays it quite well, and it all works in her favor in a huge way. I'll send you a young goat for my flock," Judah promised. "But what will you give me to guarantee that you will send the goat?" She's just playing the whole part. "What kind of guarantee do you want?" She answered, "Leave me your identification seal and its cord and the walking stick or scepter you are carrying." So Judah gave them to her. And to this we say what? Idiot! This is good stuff. This is the best of stories. Then he had intercourse with her, and she became pregnant. Afterwards, she went back home, took off her veil, and put on her widow's clothing as usual. So, the stunt she pulls, on one hand, it's utterly despicable and vile, not honorable. But on the other hand, quite clever, gutsy, and then there is a sense in which it is just. One has to at least admire her resolve. Her deceased husband is going to get his firstborn child. "Judah has yanked me around long enough. He will give me that promised son one way or another." Verse 20. Later, Judah asked his friend Hira the Adullamite to take the young goat to the woman and to pick up the things he had given her as his guarantee. But Hira couldn't find her. So he asked the men who lived there, "Where can I find the shrine prostitute who was sitting beside the road at the entrance to Enaim?" "We never had a shrine prostitute here," they replied. So Hira returned to Judah and told him, "I couldn't find her anywhere. And the men of the village claimed they've never seen a shrine prostitute." "Well, let her keep the things I gave her," Judah said. "I sent the young goat as we agreed, but you couldn't find her. We'll be the laughing stock of the village if we went back to look for her again." So what's going on here is he cannot let others know that a prostitute outwitted him. He's not willing to do that. Because if that ever gets out, he will be ridiculed as a fool. And so he's just willing to let it go. I'll keep the goat. She keeps all my proofs of identification. And clueless yet again, wrongly believes that this would be the end of it. And he has indeed done several foolish things here. But giving a prostitute his identification seal and its cord and its staff is just over the top stupid. It really is. It's like handing over to a complete stranger your wallet with all of your IDs and credit cards and driver's license. It really is. Verse 24. As to be expected, 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has acted like a prostitute, and now, because of this, she's pregnant. Bring her out and let her be burned," Judah demanded. But as they were taking her out to kill her, she sent this message to her father-in-law. "The man who owns these things made me pregnant. Look closely. Whose seal and cord and walking stick are these?" Judah recognized them immediately and said, "She is more righteous than I am because I didn't arrange for her to marry my son, Shelah." And Judah never slept with Tamar again. Again, the last sentence has to be the best line in the whole story. I wonder why. So after 3 months, just to revisit this here again, Tamar's pregnancy becomes obvious to all. Such news would readily be passed along to Judah because she still had marital obligations to his household. She was to live as a widow until his last son, Shelah, would take her into marriage. She was therefore pledged and expected to abstain from sexual activity. The passage's reference to Tamar as your daughter-in-law highlights her accountability to Judah's family's name. And so everyone naturally concluded that her pregnancy was the result of harlotry. And so she's in big trouble, and Judah is furious about it, which is ironic on several levels. One of which is the fact that he never intended to let her marry his last son, Shelah. And the other, of course, is that he is the fornicator, the whoremonger, who is responsible for her pregnancy. So, driven by anger and rage, Judah self-righteously declares her fate. Here again, we're given insight into the power vested in a patriarch. He enforced the law, whether the law of the land or the law of God, and this often included the meting out of punishments. Bring her out and let her be burned. So most likely here, this is not an order to burn her alive, but to have her body burned after being stoned to death. Cremation was punishment on top of punishment, being denied a proper burial in the family tombs, out of our sight forever and ever. So at the critical moment, Tamar reveals her possession of Judah's belongings. Anyone recognize these by chance? They belong to the one who made me pregnant. So in one moment, Judah appears to have complete power over Tamar. And in the split second, the tables are completely turned, and she has power over him. The attention is immediately redirected from Tamar's sin to Judah's sin, and Judah has no course but to admit that his sin is the greater one. To her credit, Tamar doesn't make a direct charge, but simply gives Judah the opportunity to fess up on his own, which he does. Judah's remark, "She is more righteous than I am," does not necessarily mean that her action was approved. Rather, Judah acknowledged that her motivation was consistent with the purpose of the levirate marriage, which he had attempted to avoid. And in this, when you look at it, on some level, he's just as guilty as his son Onan. One has to appreciate another piece of the irony here. Judah, if you will remember, was part of the conspiracy to fool his father, Jacob, into thinking that Joseph had been killed by wild animals. Remember that whole story? And to do this, his sons presented to Jacob Joseph's belongings as proof, namely his blood-soaked robe. Here it is Judah who has been fooled. What goes around comes around, and he is presented with his own belongings, which are used in this case to reveal several things. The cleverness of Tamar's plan and how he was fooled by her, outwitted by the quote-unquote prostitute, something he was trying to avoid, and that these things also revealed the extensiveness of his sin. You know, he tried to cheat her out of children by circumventing the levirate law, and he had illicit sex with her, meaning incest. So the irony here is rich, and it's just rich on many levels. And now to finish up the story, verse 27, when the time came for Tamar to give birth, it was discovered that she was carrying twins. While she was in labor, one of the babies reached out his hand. The midwife grabbed it, tied a scarlet string around the child's wrist, announcing, "This one came out first." Seems like a weird thing, but that's what they did. But then he pulled his hand back, and out came his brother. "What?" the midwife exclaimed. "How did you break out first?" So he was named Perez. Perez is a word meaning breaking out. And the baby with the scarlet string on his wrist was born, and he was named Zerah. And Zerah is a word that means scarlet. So the prenatal struggle, not unlike that of Jacob and Esau, brings this turbulent chapter to a fitting end and launches the tribe of Judah on its future path. Perez, the one who was born first, becomes the firstborn son. He is the one listed in the genealogies in 1 Chronicles and very important in Matthew and Luke. It was his line that led to David and so to Christ. So again, this chapter, it really does serve as a good example of how an understanding of the cultural differences is essential for appreciating all that is going on in an Old Testament narrative, which normally you would probably just miss and maybe even miss the complete point. So we have other speakers lined up for the next 3 weeks, including some personal reflections on Body Life Sunday, which will be July 2nd, and we will return to more of the Old Testament basics after that. And on that abrupt ending, I'm going to turn it over to Guy, who's going to come and close.
Thanks, Wendell, for helping us to concentrate. I think the neat part about the whole series is to constantly remind us that the Bible is written for us, but not to us, and that we need to understand who it was written to so that we can be more equipped and understand God's plan and who He is. So if everybody will rise, I'll close with prayer. Most High God, thank you for your love and your truth, and thank you for an opportunity to get to understand your word better so that we understand who you are better. Help us to be more like Jesus this week in all we do and say. In Jesus' name, amen. You're dismissed.